I never imagined that one morning could change my entire life. The sun poured through the office windows, painting the open floor in warm light. Yet all I felt was a cold knot in my stomach. I had been preparing for this moment for months. The pitch, the demo, every client statistic memorized, every slide perfected. My team was counting on me. The client was expecting brilliance, and I was ready to deliver. As I walked into the conference room, adrenaline surged. There was that peculiar energy before a storm, electric, tense, promising. My heart raced, my palms were slightly clammy, but I welcomed it. This was my moment. I clicked through the first slides with a practiced grace, smiled when the clients nodded, and began to articulate strategies with precision I had honed over years. I could see their interest growing. Every graph, every projection, every detail built the story I wanted them to see. A vision of success, of growth, of an unstoppable company that could trust only us to deliver. Then, in the middle of my most crucial point, I felt it, a whisper near my ear. A voice I had known for years, the very person I had trusted as my mentor in the company, leaned in and said, "You're done here. Pack your things, now." I froze. My mouth opened, ready to respond, but no words came. The room shifted. The client stopped writing notes. The slide clicker slipped from my hand. Eyes turned to me, then to him, then back. Confusion, curiosity, and a strange tension hovered in the air. The humiliation hit like a tidal wave. In that moment, I realized the world could be crueler than I ever imagined. My blood ran hot, my pride shattered. I had been fired, right there, in front of everyone, at the pinnacle of what was supposed to be my triumph. I left the conference room, trying to keep my composure, my mind racing. Fired mid-demo, humiliated, betrayed. And yet, amidst the anger, the embarrassment, the bitter taste of injustice, a spark lit inside me. I could feel it burning. It was not just about the demo. It was not about the clients. It was about every month, every late night, every idea I had pitched that had been ignored, stolen, or claimed by others. It was about a system that favored mediocrity over talent and greed over integrity. As I walked down the empty hallway toward my office, collecting my things, I realized that losing my job in such a spectacle was their first mistake. They thought that firing me publicly would break me. They thought I would crawl away quietly, humiliated, and never return. But they didn't know me. They didn't know that humiliation has a strange power. It can wound, yes, but it can also forge. I looked around the office one last time. The walls seemed familiar yet alien. Every desk, every cubicle, every fluorescent light now felt like part of a stage set for my undoing, but also, unknowingly, for my revenge. I cradled my laptop against my chest like a shield and a weapon, thinking of the plans I would make. Plans not out of rashness, not out of blind rage, but out of clarity, patience, and cold logic. The world had just declared me powerless. I would make sure that in time they would regret it. Every whisper, every deal, every hidden corruption I had glimpsed over the years could be turned against them. And so, in that humiliating, crushing moment, a new resolve formed in me. I would rise, not immediately, not recklessly, but strategically, quietly, and with precision. They thought firing me mid-demo was the end of my story. They had no idea it was only the beginning. After leaving that conference room, the world outside felt strangely muted. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant chatter of colleagues, even the click of my heels on the polished floor. It all seemed distant, unreal, as if I were trapped in some distorted version of my own life. The office I had known so well, the place where I had spent countless nights perfecting presentations and strategies, suddenly felt alien. Every corner, every cubicle, every familiar face now seemed like a reminder of what I had lost, and of what had betrayed me. I went to my office one last time, gathering my things. My laptop, notebooks, and personal files felt heavier than usual, not just physically, but emotionally. As I packed, my mind raced, tracing back every interaction, every decision, every friendly advice that had been given with a hidden motive. It wasn't just my career that had been sabotaged. It was my reputation, my dignity, and the years of hard work I had poured into the company. I realized that this wasn't just about Mr. W's envy or the company's greed. This was systemic. The betrayal was embedded in the culture itself. For the first time, I let myself truly reflect. I remembered the subtle manipulations, the small, almost invisible obstacles I had faced. Promotions delayed, ideas ignored, credits stolen. I had always assumed it was office politics, a part of climbing the corporate ladder. But now it was clear. It had been intentional. Every misstep, every hesitation I'd been accused of had been orchestrated. And the demo? That was the final act. The public execution meant to silence me. But as the sting of humiliation began to fade, a different emotion took root. Anger, yes, but sharper, colder than I had ever felt. Not a blind fury, but a precise, focused determination. I wasn't going to cry over what they had done. I wasn't going to beg for redemption or plead for recognition. No. I was going to make them pay in a way they would never see coming. The first step was observation. I spent days watching, listening, documenting. Every email, every contract, every internal memo became a puzzle piece. I realized that Mr. W had grown complacent, arrogant even. He trusted the company's bureaucracy to shield him from scrutiny. He had no idea that someone had been quietly paying attention to the cracks in his empire. Every favoritism, every misappropriated fund, every unapproved deal. All of it was exposed in plain sight if one only knew where to look. Meanwhile, the office moved on. Colleagues whispered, smiled, avoided me. Some offered sympathetic words that felt hollow. Others, more cunning, celebrated my downfall in secret. It was a delicate dance, but one I studied carefully. I knew who my allies were, who my enemies truly were, and who was simply waiting to see which side would benefit from my misfortune. At night, I pored over legal filings, industry news, and regulatory loopholes. I started sketching out strategies, not just to regain what I had lost, but to dismantle the very foundation of the empire that had betrayed me. I didn't rush. I planned with the patience of someone who had been underestimated for too long. Every detail mattered. Every misstep I had endured could now be transformed into leverage, into tools of justice. By the end of that week, a clear picture emerged. This was no longer just personal revenge. It was opportunity. I could expose corruption, reclaim power, and show them that their attempts to humiliate me had been catastrophic mistakes. Every forced smile, every whispered insult, every underhanded tactic they had used would become fuel for my comeback. And so, amidst the solitude and reflection, a seed was planted. The office that had felt like a tomb of my career would soon become the stage for my resurgence. I would not just survive, I would rise, not with chaos or recklessness, but with precision, strategy, and control. They had thought firing me mid-demo would break me. They had no idea it would create the most dangerous version of myself. Calm, calculated, and ready. The days after my firing were surreal. I walked the streets like a ghost, a mix of humiliation and determination fueling every step. I couldn't just sit back and watch my career crumble. The betrayal had left its mark, but it had also sharpened my mind. Every detail, every hint of office politics, every subtle manipulation, I replayed them endlessly, searching for weaknesses I could exploit. I began quietly reaching out to old contacts, clients I had nurtured for years. I didn't tell them I had been fired. There was no need. Actions speak louder than words. My reputation had always been solid. A few carefully timed check-ins, subtle reminders of my successes, and suddenly, doors that had seemed closed started to open. Some clients even hinted at frustration with my former company, unaware that I had orchestrated the perfect timing for their dissatisfaction. Back at the office, life went on, or at least it pretended to. Mr. W strutted through the halls like nothing had changed, but cracks were already forming. I had always suspected he was reckless with client accounts and internal budgets, but now I had proof, or at least enough breadcrumbs to follow. Every memo, every approval signature, every forgotten audit line became a piece of the puzzle. I started documenting everything. Spreadsheets, emails, meeting notes. I collected them quietly, methodically. It felt almost addictive, this hunt for evidence, this slow dismantling of the facade they had carefully maintained. Each discovery made my pulse race. Unreported profits, mismanaged projects, favoritism in hiring. and financial maneuvers that were ethically questionable, if not outright illegal. Meanwhile, whispers of my disappearance began circulating inside the office. Colleagues who had previously ignored or betrayed me grew cautious. Some approached me cautiously, pretending to be supportive, while others retreated, fearful that I might somehow regain influence. Little did they know, I had no intention of returning as an employee. My plans were bigger and my methods smarter. I realized something vital. Revenge wasn't about chaos. It wasn't about yelling in boardrooms or exposing myself recklessly. It was about strategy, precision, and patience. If I rushed, I risked losing everything I had quietly regained. I had to bide my time, let the pieces align, and strike when the timing was perfect. At night, I pored over the patterns of Mr. W's behavior. The arrogance, the overconfidence, the assumption that no one noticed, those were weaknesses I could exploit. I mapped his interactions, his dependencies, even the small favors he expected in return for promotions and bonuses. Everything could be turned into leverage. And yet, the most difficult part wasn't the strategy. It was the emotional battlefield inside me. Every memory of humiliation, every echo of that moment in the conference room still burned. It was a double-edged sword. Anger drove me, but it also threatened to cloud my judgment. I had to keep it controlled, channel it into meticulous, calculated steps rather than impulsive action. Then came the confirmation of what I had feared but suspected. Some of my so-called allies at the company had aligned with Mr. W. They had been feeding him information about my moves, anticipating my actions. Every advantage I thought I had was slightly offset by betrayal I hadn't expected. It was infuriating and yet strangely liberating. Now I knew exactly who I was up against. I had one option: play smarter. Every ally, every enemy, every overlooked flaw became a tool. The battlefield was set. I wasn't just fighting to reclaim what I had lost. I was preparing to dismantle everything they had built. And in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets and printed emails, I smiled. I wasn't defeated, not yet. They had underestimated me once. They would not make that mistake again. I had known betrayal before, in subtle, almost invisible ways. The stolen credit, the whispered gossip, the backhanded compliments from colleagues masquerading as support. But nothing prepared me for the depth of treachery I would uncover next. It started with a casual coffee meeting with someone I had trusted implicitly. Someone who had been my mentor, my guide through the labyrinth of office politics. I had confided in them, shared insights, plans, and frustrations, believing that loyalty existed somewhere in that corporate jungle. I was wrong. That meeting was the moment the knife twisted. As I spoke, outlining thoughts about client strategies and potential opportunities, I saw a flicker in their eyes, an eagerness that shouldn't have been there. Weeks later, it became painfully clear. Every move I made, every subtle maneuver I had plotted had been anticipated. Emails I thought were private had been leaked. Plans I had carefully structured were countered before I could act. My confidant had fed information directly to Mr. W. I felt a cold, suffocating shock. It wasn't just about losing my job anymore. It was about realizing that the people closest to me had been complicit in my humiliation. I had trusted them implicitly. I had believed that some loyalty existed, even in a world built on manipulation. That illusion had shattered, and with it, a piece of my heart. The betrayal didn't stop there. As I dug deeper, I discovered a web of alliances I hadn't seen before. Colleagues who had smiled in the hallway while congratulating me, who had acted supportive when I was building client relationships, were in fact aligned with Mr. W. They had whispered doubts about my competence, misrepresented my actions to the board, and subtly sabotaged my initiatives. Even the HR representative who had interviewed me during hiring rotations had been part of a quiet network protecting Mr. W's interests. The realization was devastating, yet it illuminated a path forward. Every betrayal, every hidden agenda became information I could leverage. If they had thought they could manipulate me, control me, and leave me powerless, they had made a critical mistake. Betrayal is only effective if the betrayed remains blind. I was not blind. I began meticulously mapping the network of deception, creating mental dossiers of every ally and enemy. I tracked patterns of communication, noting who had advanced under Mr. W's favoritism, who had covered up missteps, and who had been quietly undermining me for months. Every lie, every act of manipulation, every hidden motive became a piece of a larger puzzle, one I intended to solve completely. And then, a deeper truth hit me. The person I had trusted most, my mentor, had been motivated not just by self-interest but by fear. Fear of losing favor, fear of stepping outside the shadow of Mr. W, fear of being exposed themselves. That fear had driven them to betray me, yet that same fear was now a weapon I could use. Fear is contagious after all. When wielded correctly, it can crumble even the strongest facade. By the end of the week, I felt a strange clarity. Betrayal, which once had the power to wound, now became my tool. Every deceit I uncovered added fuel to my strategy, sharpened my focus, and strengthened my resolve. I was no longer the employee who had been humiliated mid-demo. I was something far more dangerous. An observer, a strategist, and a quiet force building toward an inevitable reckoning. I closed my laptop that night, staring at the ceiling, and whispered to myself, they thought they were untouchable. They thought loyalty didn't exist outside their circle. They thought I would fade quietly into obscurity. But betrayal had taught me one vital lesson. Knowledge is power, and power, when exercised carefully, can bring even the most arrogant to their knees. And in the darkness, I began drafting the blueprint of what would become their downfall. Every betrayal would be accounted for, every act of disloyalty exposed. The ones who had smiled while stabbing me in the back would soon discover that the knife cuts both ways, and that I had been forging mine in secret, silently, patiently, perfectly. Revenge, I learned, is not a single blow. It's an architecture. Blueprints, scaffolding, careful timing. Once betrayal had stripped away my illusions, I set about building something far more dangerous than anger. A plan with teeth. I didn't want theatrics. I wanted inevitability. First, I organized what I had. Spreadsheets, emails, contract amendments. Anything that hinted at the pattern of favors and off-book entries. I translated them into narratives a non-technical person could follow. Who benefited, when money moved, which approvals were missing, and where signatures had been forged or glossed over. A story with dates, names, and numbers. Evidence with context. Evidence that would survive questions. Then I built a perimeter. I knew going to the press first would look like a vendetta. Going to regulators without a solid chain of custody would be dismissed. So I created multiple channels. Anonymous tips slipped to compliance officers at partner firms. Carefully worded queries to auditors that would force them to look where I wanted. Confidential conversations with ex-clients who had been quietly dissatisfied for months. Each touchpoint was small on its own, but together they formed a pressure system. One that would eventually force the cracks to show. While the pressure built externally, I worked internally from a different angle. I founded a small consultancy, a lean, expert team positioned as a strategic partner for clients in our sector. I didn't announce it loudly. No vanity press releases. I reached out to 2 clients I'd worked with for years, not with desperation, but with quiet confidence. We can solve this, I said. On your terms, they listened. One meeting turned into a pilot. The pilot turned into a retainer. Word spread in hushed, excited tones. There was a new, capable alternative to the old guard. Hiring was surgical. I recruited people who understood systems. A former compliance analyst, a numbers person who loved forensic puzzles, and a project lead who could sell strategy while keeping secrets. We signed non-disclosure agreements that were ironclad. We worked nights. We modeled deals. We built an offering that mirrored the strengths of my old company but without the rot. Slowly, quietly, my firm began to win the very clients Mr. W thought were untouchable. Parallel to the business, I deployed a psychological campaign. I didn't leak everything at once. I let rumors seed, small, believable whispers that something was off. I sent anonymized summaries of discrepancies to board members who had shown independence in the past. I flagged specific invoices without naming people, forcing internal auditors to open files they'd ignored. Each nudge increased scrutiny and made Mr. W nervous. He began to double-check his numbers. He began to ask the wrong questions in public. Legally, I kept everything airtight. I documented my methods, retained counsel who specialized in corporate fraud, and preserved the chain of custody for every file I intended to use. When the time came to hand over evidence, it had to be unassailable. Dates matched timestamps, emails had headers intact, and financial anomalies were traced through multiple ledgers. There would be no room for plausible deniability. But perhaps the most effective move was subtle and almost cruel in its simplicity. I reclaimed relationships. Those colleagues who had been pushed aside by Mr. W's network, quiet, competent people who resented favoritism, found a home at my new firm. They brought with them institutional knowledge, client trust, and, most importantly, the quiet satisfaction of working for someone who actually saw their talent. As my team grew, so did our credibility. The market noticed. Timing was everything. I synchronized the release of evidence with a client announcement that would affect Mr. W's largest accounts. The day the client signed with us, an anonymous dossier was delivered to a board member and to an industry reporter. Facts laid bare, no melodrama, only the arithmetic of mismanagement. The reaction was immediate. Internal audits were demanded, legal teams mobilized, and the board finally had to confront what everyone had whispered about for years. I didn't celebrate the chaos. My satisfaction was not in watching people panic. It was in watching truth demand accountability. The plan had been to remove the shelter that protected Mr. W and his allies. Secrecy. With secrecy gone, the rest followed naturally. Regulatory scrutiny turned into subpoenas. Investors pulled back. People who had once smiled in the hallway now avoided eye contact. By the time the board convened to discuss Mr. W's fate, I stood across the table not as a victim, but as a founder and an expert, someone who had built a credible alternative and assembled the facts in a way that forced action. Revenge had been a patient, surgical operation. It had required restraint as much as resolve. In the end, what I engineered wasn't ruin for the sake of ruin. It was a reclamation of reputation, of justice, and of the dignity that had been taken from me mid-demo. The plan had worked because it was smart, legal, and inevitable. And in that inevitability lay the quietest, most complete victory of all. The day of reckoning arrived like a thunderclap, sudden, loud, impossible to ignore. I walked into the boardroom, not as the trembling figure they'd pushed into the hallway months ago, but as someone who had watched, planned, and quietly built an alternative. My suit fit like armor. My voice was steady. I carried with me a folder heavy with facts, not fury. The room smelled of polished wood and stale confidence. Mr. W sat at the head of the table, eyes bright with the arrogance of a man who believed his control was absolute. Around him, the board shuffled papers, exchanged thin smiles, and adjusted ties as if posture could defend their reputations. They hadn't yet seen the map I'd drawn, how every misallocated fund, every forged approval, every favor had a trail leading straight back to him. I began with the simplest thing, a timeline. Dates, signatures, and the money trail. No accusations first, just the arithmetic of mistakes and manipulations. I watched their faces change, minute by minute. Confusion gave way to concern to disbelief, disbelief to the tight, white panic that only emerges when the shelter of plausible deniability begins to collapse. Mr. W tried his usual tactics, distraction, charm, and the occasional bluff. He smiled as if the world could be schooled by charisma. He attempted to reframe the numbers, to claim clerical errors, to paint complex transactions as innocent oversights. But the evidence was patient and precise. Timestamps that matched emails, signatures that didn't align with authorized approvals, invoice chains that looped into shell accounts. My counsel had prepared a crosswalk of documents that left no comfortable gaps. Then came the announcement that shifted everything from corporate scandal to seismic. One of the firm's largest clients, an account Mr. W had touted as untouchable, stood with me. Their procurement director spoke with quiet authority, confirming the reason for their move: mismanagement, a lack of transparency, and a breach of trust. The room went cold. I felt the air change as if someone had drawn a curtain across the grand hall of their empire. Mr. W's posture crumpled the way arrogance does when it meets immovable fact. He fumbled explanations, then excuses, then finally silence. People shifted in their seats like leaves in a storm. The legal counsel whispered into headsets. Phones vibrated. The board chair, who had always deferred to Mr. W, found a spine stiffened by fear. She called for an immediate audit, and for Mr. W to step aside pending an inquiry. Outside, Whispers turned into messages, and then into calls. My inbox flooded with tentative offers, cautious congratulations, and guarded revenge seekers who suddenly wanted alignment. Reporters who had once filed my name under former employee pinged with questions that smelled of front-page ink. The pressure I'd engineered from months of small, precise nudges now pressed against the walls of their confidence and began to crack them open. What struck me in that moment was not the spectacle, but the quiet efficiency of truth. It didn't need drama. It needed clarity. It didn't need vindication. It needed accountability. Watching Mr. W escorted from the room felt oddly anticlimactic. The true victory was how the system, auditors, clients, regulators, began to move in prescribed ways once the right levers had been pulled. As the board convened in private, murmuring legalese and damage control, I stood at the edge of the storm and felt, for the first time in months, a strange calm. The plan had worked because it had been unromantic and methodical, because it had relied on facts rather than fury. I had not shouted. I had not clamored for attention. I had delivered a map and let the terrain do the rest. Before I left, a junior analyst I once mentored slipped me a folded note. It read, "You did what we all needed. Thank you." It was proof that justice had a human face, that the work wasn't only about personal vindication, but about a healthier place for those who'd been silenced. Walking out of that building, I didn't feel triumphant in a noisy way. I felt settled, like a long equation finally balanced. Mr. W's empire had begun to unravel, but the aftermath would be messy and fraught. That was not my joy. My satisfaction lay in the quiet restoration of truth, the reclaiming of dignity stolen mid-demo, and the knowledge that I had engineered an outcome that left no comfortable lies. The storm had hit. Now the clearing would begin. I stepped into the sunlight with a steady breath, aware that everything that followed would demand different skills: rebuilding, stewardship, and the resilience to lead in a quieter, tenser aftermath. The chaos that followed was almost poetic. Mr. W was forced to step down immediately, facing investigations that would keep him occupied for months. His carefully constructed empire began to wobble. Projects stalled, clients hesitated, and internal audits uncovered more discrepancies than anyone had anticipated. The whispers in the corridors shifted, from doubt about me to fear and awe of what had been orchestrated. My former colleagues watched the upheaval with wide eyes. Some tried to save face, claiming ignorance. Others quietly sought ways to align with my new firm, understanding that power had quietly shifted. The mentor who had betrayed me disappeared from internal communications, replaced by silence and occasional regretful glances. The people who had humiliated me or undermined me now tiptoed in my direction, unsure if I was friend, foe, or untouchable. I didn't gloat. I didn't send messages or relish in public humiliation. That satisfaction had been mine long before the boardroom drama, in the patience and precision of every move I had made. I had reclaimed what was taken: dignity, influence, and control. My firm grew steadily, quietly becoming a respected alternative to the company that had once fired me in front of clients. Walking past my old office building months later, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. The space that had once felt like a cage of politics and betrayal was now irrelevant. I had built something far more resilient outside those walls, an empire born of strategy, skill, and calm vengeance. Sometimes victory doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through the corridors of those who underestimated you. I had been humiliated, betrayed, and fired mid-demo. But I had become the very force they feared, proving that patience and precision can rewrite the rules of power. Looking back, the lesson wasn't just about revenge. It was about patience, strategy, and knowing your own worth. Life will throw betrayals, humiliations, and moments designed to make you feel powerless. The difference between being a victim and reclaiming control lies in how you respond. Chaos can break a person, but calm, deliberate action can turn it into opportunity. I learned that trust must be earned, that loyalty is rare, and that power often hides behind quiet manipulation. But I also discovered that knowledge, foresight, and careful planning are weapons far stronger than anger or impulse. By observing, calculating, and acting with precision, I was able to turn every act of betrayal into leverage, every humiliation into motivation, and every obstacle into a stepping stone toward something greater. Revenge, I realized, doesn't have to be loud or vengeful in the traditional sense. It can be quiet, methodical, and deeply satisfying in the knowledge that truth and skill have corrected an imbalance. I didn't just reclaim my career. I reclaimed my dignity, my reputation, and my power. The people who doubted me, betrayed me, or underestimated me were forced to face the consequences of their own actions. In the end, the most potent victories aren't about tearing others down. They're about rising above, building something stronger, and letting the results speak for themselves. Humiliation fades, greed collapses under scrutiny, and integrity, quietly and patiently, prevails. This is Karma Unfolded, where every secret finds its reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe.